You have eaten bread your entire life without once thinking about what it cost. Not money, not calories, something older than both of those things. Bread is the reason you live in a city. It is the reason you pay taxes. It is the reason governments exist, armies march, and empires fall. No single food has done more to shape the human species than a few crushed grains mixed with water and pressed against heat. And the story of how that happened is stranger, darker, and more consequential than almost anything you were taught in school. It starts not with a farmer, but with a forager. For most of human history, your ancestors did not plant anything. They moved. They followed seasons, tracked animals, dug roots, gathered seeds. Life was hard, but it was varied. The diet was wide. No single food could fail and take everyone with it. Then something shifted. Around 14,000 years ago, in a stretch of land that arched from modern-day Jordan through Syria and into Iraq, a group of people called the Natufians began doing something strange. They were not farmers. They had no fields, but they were settling down. They built stone structures. They ground seeds with flat rocks. And in 2018, archaeologist Amaya Arant-Sadigui and her team made a discovery at a site called Shubaika 1 in the Black Desert of Jordan that changed what we thought we knew. They found charred flatbread, 14,400 years old, made by people who had never planted a single seed. Bread came before farming. That one fact reorders everything. For decades, the story was simple. Humans invented agriculture. Agriculture gave them grain. Grain became bread. But the Natufians suggest something more interesting. They were already making bread from wild grains long before anyone thought to plant them. The bread came first. And it may have been bread, the desire to have it reliably, that drove the invention of farming in the first place. Think about what that means. The entire agricultural revolution, the single most consequential shift in human history, may have happened because someone wanted to stop walking so far to find enough grain to grind. By 10,000 years ago, farming had taken hold in the Fertile Crescent. Wheat and barley were being cultivated. Settlements grew, and with permanent settlements came something new: surplus. When you grow more food than you can eat today, you have to store it. When you store it, you have to protect it. When you protect it, you need someone in charge of the protection. And just like that, almost without anyone deciding it should happen, you have hierarchy. You have power. You have the early skeleton of civilization. Bread did not feed civilization. Bread built the conditions that made civilization possible. Nowhere is this clearer than in ancient Egypt. The pyramids of Giza, still standing after 4,000 years, were not built by slaves. That is a myth that took centuries to undo. They were built by paid workers. And what were those workers paid in? Bread. The records survive. Each worker received 10 loaves a day as their wage, along with a ration of beer made from the same grain. The entire economy of one of history's greatest building projects ran on fermented grain products. Bread was not just food, it was currency. Historian Peter Garnsey, who spent decades studying food and society in the ancient world, documented how deeply grain became embedded in the politics of classical civilizations. In Rome, the connection between bread and power became explicit in a way that would not surprise anyone who has ever watched a government manage a crisis. The Roman state provided free grain, and eventually free bread, to hundreds of thousands of citizens in the capital. The poet Juvenal had a phrase for it: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they will not ask dangerous questions. It was not a conspiracy. It was policy, and it worked for centuries. Rome's grain came almost entirely from North Africa. Egypt was called the breadbasket of the empire. Enormous fleets of ships moved nothing but grain across the Mediterranean, year after year, to feed a city of 1 million people who could not feed themselves. When that supply was threatened, emperors panicked. When it was cut, governments fell. This is the other side of bread. The same dependency that made civilizations possible made them fragile in ways that nothing else could. In the summer of 1788, the harvest across France failed. It had been a brutal year. A summer hailstorm had flattened crops across wide stretches of the country, and then a winter so cold that grain stores froze and rivers used for milling ice over. By the spring of 1789, the price of bread in Paris had reached 80 to 90% of a working person's daily wage. People were spending almost everything they earned just to eat. Just to eat bread, the one food that was supposed to be available to everyone. What followed is called the French Revolution, but it might more accurately be called what happens when bread runs out. The storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, is remembered as a political event, a strike for liberty, a rebellion against tyranny. And it was all of those things. But the women who marched on Versailles 3 months later, the October March, were not chanting abstractions. They were chanting for bread. They dragged the royal family back to Paris because the royal family was in Versailles while people in the city were starving. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said let them eat cake. But the reason that story stuck, the reason it became the symbol of the era, is because it captured something real. Bread had become the measure of whether a government deserved to survive. The same pattern appears across history with remarkable consistency. The Roman grain shortages of the 3rd century contributed to the collapse of the Western Empire. The Byzantine state's grain distribution failures helped open the door to the Arab conquests of the 7th century. The Irish famine of the 1840, though centered on potatoes rather than wheat, followed an identical logic. When the staple crop fails, the government that cannot respond loses its claim to legitimacy. Sometimes it loses everything else as well. What made bread so powerful and so dangerous was not just that people needed it. It was that they came to depend on it exclusively. Archaeologist Andrew Sherratt, who spent much of his career tracing what he called the secondary products revolution, noted that as agriculture intensified, diets actually narrowed. Hunter-gatherers ate hundreds of different plants and animals across the year. Early agricultural societies ate fewer. By the height of the great grain empires, large portions of the population were surviving primarily on bread and very little else. All of that human survival rested on one category of plant, in a handful of varieties, grown in specific regions, vulnerable to the same weather, the same blights, the same political disruptions. You had traded flexibility for scale. And scale, once it reaches a certain size, becomes a trap. The irony is that bread itself is not especially nutritious by the standards of what it replaced. Wild game, foraged plants, fish, and roots gave your ancestors a broader spectrum of vitamins and minerals than wheat alone could provide. The skeletons found at early agricultural sites are shorter than the skeletons of the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Their teeth are worse. Their bones show signs of nutritional stress that were rarer in pre-agricultural populations. In some measurable physical ways, the invention of bread made individual humans less healthy, but it made groups of humans more powerful, more organized, more capable of building, conquering, and persisting across centuries. The bargain was population over individual well-being. More people, more concentrated, more dependent on a system that required constant management. Bread was the founding contract of civilization, and like most contracts, it benefited some people far more than others. By the 20th century, that contract had been rewritten again. In 1961, a process developed at the Chorleywood Bread Research Institute in England changed industrial bread production completely. It used high-speed mixing, chemical additives, and processing shortcuts that allowed bread to be made in a fraction of the time using lower-quality wheat. The loaf that most people in the industrialized world now buy in a plastic bag is almost unrecognizable, at a molecular level, from what anyone would have called bread for the previous 14,000 years. Cheaper, faster, everywhere, and yet you keep eating it. The same impulse that drove a Natufian forager to grind wild grain against a flat stone in the Jordanian desert is still operating somewhere inside you. The smell of bread baking is one of the most universally recognized comfort signals in the human world. Something in your nervous system responds to it before your conscious mind has time to think. You did not choose that response. It was chosen for you, over thousands of years, by every ancestor who survived because they found enough grain to grind. Bread did not just feed civilization. It built it. It sustained it. It defined who had power and who did not. It triggered revolutions. It ended empires. And it is still doing all of those things, quietly, inside supply chains and trade agreements and agricultural subsidies that most people never think about once. You have eaten bread your entire life without thinking about what it cost. Now you know.